Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. It's been something of a propaganda extravaganza, the way the globalists and their flunkies in the media try to downplay the effect of mass migration on rental prices and home prices in the West. So their argument is you can bring in millions and gazillions of people into a country and it'll have no effect at all on the pricing of a limited or restricted product such as housing. So, I mean, is anyone supposed to believe that nonsense that they're putting about? The reality is, no matter how you look at it, and in spite of quite an aggressive, home building program, particularly with apartments, in spite of that, the price of real estate is going through the roof. Now, there's a number of studies around that the government and the various media outlets attempt to bury, and some of these are in Europe and elsewhere, and they're all in the West because the white West is where the mass migration is. So what these studies find, I mean, this is hardly rocket science, is that the more people move into an area, and the speed in which they move into an area, and this could be a city, for example, like Sydney or I don't know, New York or wherever, London, it has an effect on real estate prices. Now, again, there's nothing surprising. Of course it does. And you get a lot more people with a lot more money chasing a supply of property that's only slightly increasing, even though demand is going through the roof. Now, it's not a supply and demand thing, because when the COVID thing was going on and all these people, like millions of them, left Australia, went back to India and China and elsewhere, the price of property didn't go down, and the rental prices went down by 2 or 3% or something. So they hardly were affected at all. Whereas in a market-driven economy, then the prices of rents would have gone through the floor, and as indeed would prices of property for sale, mortgages. So we're not talking about a market-driven situation here. The market forces only work one way, we're supposed to believe, and that's upward, never sideways or downward, which is, of course, absurd. Market forces don't work like that. They move up and down. Now, I just wanted to have a look at, there's a few studies out of Europe and the United States, and they come out with pretty consistent sort of numbers, and this is what I wanted to highlight here. So now the population of Sydney over 26 years has increased by 46%. That's a staggering fucking increase in population. It just goes to show you the effect of the mass migration. That's something like give or take an extra 1.8 million people have come into Sydney. And given the birth rates and the death rates, you look at that, pretty much all of that, 98% of it is from mass migration. So the idea that it's local birth rates or anything natural or organic is bullshit. This is all down to mass migration. So another, give or take, 1.8 million people have arrived, and they need somewhere to live. Now, a lot of these, especially the peasants and the students and so on, they may live 10, 15, 20 people to a two-bedroom apartment. So this idea that every one of those 1.8 million people has a separate residence, that's not right. So we can look at the number of dwellings that were supposedly built during that time, and then have a look at the number of people coming in, and then have a look at the amount of offshore buying by offshore money laundering investors. Now we can see offshore money laundering investors are also playing a role in this. It's not just the mass migration, stopping the offshore buying a property, whether they use local nominees or do it through offshore banks. That's something really needs to be cracked down on. Also, the amount of people that buy property for the sole purposes of putting it up for Airbnb and these sorts of things, and through that they can still claim various tax deductions and tax offsets that they shouldn't really be, in my view, entitled to. Nonetheless, That's the 46% population increase of Sydney over the last 26 years. Now the claim is, and again, this the studies sort of hold pretty consistent across the range here, whether it's a study in Northern Europe or Central Europe or Australia or the United States or wherever, that for every 5% of population increase, and we're talking condensed into this time frame, for every 5% of population increase, then rents increase by 11 to 12% over that same period. So that's the ratio of. Now again, they don't break it down to people, for example, Indian or Pakistani, Bangladeshi students living 10 to a 1-bedroom apartment or 20 to a 2-bedroom apartment. They don't break it down that way. And I'll come back to that in a minute. They also don't break down the the offshore buying of property and then taking that property away from being a rental or residential type property and turning it into an Airbnb or just an investment property that's left vacant. There are close to 1 million properties in Australia currently that are unoccupied. This is all across Australia, by the way, not just Sydney. But again, nearly all of these properties are owned by offshore investors, so who are using it again for money laundering. So that also needs to be, factored into the equation. Now, there's various claims that just before the mass migration thing kicked off, that there was a sharp downturn in the amount of new buildings being started in Australia at the time of considerable economic buoyancy, by the way. So it wasn't related to like a recession or economic downturn, far from it. So somehow at the same time as new building approvals went down, so it's reducing the amount of stock for sale. At that same time, mass migration kicked off. But at that same time, when new buildings approvals were falling, politicians were madly buying up every piece of real estate that they could lay their hands on. So clearly there was an insider, in my view, there was clearly an insider trading thing going on where the political class knew they were about to start the mass migration. They knew the effect it would have on real estate prices. And so they went out on a buying spree of property, assisted by, again, the banks who were in on the insider trading, I believe. So, so if we look at the 46% increase in population, so if we look at according to the study here, 5% of population increase, this is due to swift population, not organic population that occurs over time, say where babies are born, but they live in the house with their parents, of course. This is mass migration that creates new adults coming in en masse, taking up new, creating new demand for rentals and property buying and so on. So for every 5% of population increase, rents go up by 11 or 12%. So if you look at the 46% increase in Sydney's population, remember these are adults all arriving at once, then we're looking at 2, 8, 9 times. So it's a nine times increase in demand. So this is basically 100% increase in a price. This is the effect of rents. So this is huge. I mean, this is massive. And just looking at the amount of looking at how rents have increased. Now, looking at an area that's got some fairly intensive mass migration and a lot of activity by offshore property speculators, the rents are like you could excuse me, you could rent a property for say $350 in 1997, 1998, 1999, and then suddenly it was almost like a jackknifing effect or atomic bomb effect. Property prices, rental prices, just starting to go hysterical. So a property that was $350 then, unimproved, so it's still got fixtures and fittings in it that are 40 to 50 years old, and yet the rental has gone up to over $1,000 a week for for the same property. So this is an unimproved property. It's not like they've refurbed the whole property and put in top of the line fixtures and fittings and added a swimming pool into the grounds. There's no. It's still an old. The carpets look like they're from 50 years ago, and yet they're asking for, demanding, and getting, by the way, $1,000 a week. Now, also times have changed insofar as the top dollar rents are being demanded, but the property owners are prepared to sit on it for as long as it takes to get a tenant at that price. They're under no pressure at all to reduce the price in order to get the property rented quickly. So they can have a property up for rent for 6 months, 12 months. They don't care. They're not under any financial pressure. Now, typically in a market-driven economy, as I've mentioned in other videos, that wouldn't be the case. They'd be very keen and eager to put a renter into that so they could get that rental income. And that's how it was, years ago. As a the college kid type thing, is I'd go out looking for places to rent, and they were so keen to rent that the real estate agent would come and meet you at a time of your choosing. None of this, there's a viewing time on this day, and if you can't make it, too bad, and there'd be a line going back 100 meters to inspect the property. That there wasn't like that. They would come and meet you at a time of your choosing, and the rents were always competitive and driven by market prices. The property owner was very keen to get a tenant into the property, and the real estate agent would just give you discounts on the spot. If you weren't happy with the advertised price, we can do better. We can reduce it by 10%. If you're interested, and then if you even hesitated to book, they take another few bucks off. So that's how keen and motive they were then. That's not the case. You just don't see that anywhere. Property owners prepared to wait forever in order to get a tenant that pays. So even during COVID, when properties were unoccupied for two years, for goodness sakes, a rental property, still the rental price didn't come down. It stayed about the same. Or they may give an inducement of like, we'll give you the first week rent for free, something like that. But other than that, the rental prices just didn't really come down at all. So again, confirmation it's not market-driven situation here. Or as the demand drops off, it's not market-driven. But when the demand comes in, it's acutely sensitive to demand, and prices go up sort of immediately. So this gives you an idea of the effect of mass migration numbers on rents. And this is all across the Western world. It's not just Australia. Sydney and Melbourne are harder hit than maybe some other places because most people want to come to Sydney and Melbourne. They come from the third world. Well, it doesn't matter if they're students or not. And there are students from rich, wealthy Chinese communist goon general, families that come to Australia, and they just act as nominees for their family, and they'll buy 3 or 4 multi-million-dollar properties. Again, money laundering gig. So you've got the 20-year-old student that owns four waterfront mansion properties and multiple Ferraris and so on. And this is permitted and allowed by our government. So the government could easily clamp down on a lot of these abuses. Now, coming back to the point now of collective or communal living, so, people coming, especially the rural peasants and so on from India or Bangladesh or somewhere like that. Now they will live, they'll happily live 20 to a 2-bedroom apartment. They've got things like electric lights that work, a flushing toilet, which is a bit of a novelty for them. So they live there, and they think that's not so bad because they live in very cramped conditions in the third world shitholes they come from. So even upmarket living in some of these Asian shithole cities, upmarket living is where you share a shoebox room with another person, and you're sharing one toilet that only sometimes works with 50 people. So 20 people to a 2-bedroom apartment is considered pretty upmarket living to some of these folks. But there's 20 of them all working part-time as pizza delivery or DoorDash or toilet cleaners or whatever. And so the the real estate agents in Australia who contribute to this, and a lot of these real estate agents now aren't local Anglo-Saxons, many of them. In fact, in some areas, you'd be struggle to find a real estate agent that wasn't Chinese or Indian or Arabic or something. And they come from these very corrupt societies. And so corruption and all sorts of subversion is just how these people do business. So they say, look, it goes like this. Okay, well, the local government rules are that no more than 4 people can live in this apartment. And you've got 20 living here. But I tell you what, we'll look the other way. We'll pretend we haven't seen it. So 20 people live. But even though the rent is meant to be, and I'll just use round numbers for simplicity, even though the rent's meant to be $100 a week, you're going to have to pay $150 for us to keep quiet about your law breaking, about how many people you got living here. So they pool all their resources, all their piece of delivery incomes and everything. They pool those resources and financial resources, and they can afford this higher rent because there's 20 of them living there. And this artificially pushes up the price of the rents because you've got 20 income earners living in that 2-bedroom apartment, whereas in reality, given Australian social structure and living standards, you'd have 1 or maybe 2 maximum income earners living in that apartment or renting that apartment. So this completely changes the overall sort of macroeconomics, if you like, of renting. So now, if something breaks down in the apartment, like the oven doesn't work or something like that, or there's rain leaking through the roof, there's not much these people can do about it because they make a complaint and make a fuss to the real estate. The real estate, hey, look, I can put another 20 Bangladeshis in here anytime I want. So if you're going to cause trouble, I'll just complain to the government that there's 20 living here. Then you'll get an immigration department raid, and do you want that? So these sorts of things are going on. Excuse me, are going on all the time now, and the offshore buying of property. All these things contribute in aggregation to the increase in rents. And I've mentioned before about the flipping of properties. A property that may be completely is always being bought and flipped at the highest price of the as in real estate purchase price, is always creating a higher level of pressure for rents. So rents are escalating in line with the amount of times a property is flipped. So if you look at a property that, say, is fully owned and has been for some time, owned within a family, say, and typically the rents they're asking are maybe ballpark around half of the top market rate rents that are being around. So this too is something that, as long as property, residential property, is not treated as a place to live in, but an investment asset class, and it's being flipped constantly for quick buck profits, it in turn creates a pressure on rents and indeed ongoing prices, which feed back into this inflation, which goes well beyond incomes. Now, a lot of jobs that employment jobs that say in 1999 paid 50,000, for example, paid 50,000 bucks a year. Those jobs pay about the same now, maybe a little bit more, but around the same. So there's been no wage inflation in certain wage sectors and employment sectors, whereas rents have gone up by three times plus. So, or mortgages for that matter, house prices. So this sort of illustrates the wider thing. But these claims that the globalist controlled propaganda media saying, mass migration's got no effect on real estate. Silly. That's just Hitler, Nazi, fascist swastika talk. No, nothing to see here. That's bullshit. Now, the point that they also make that if supply was increased substantially, that would have some sort of leveling effect on real estate prices. That's kind of true, or has an element or a small kernel of truth in it, but only a small kernel. If you look at the chart of increased house building and apartment building from the time it started to really go up, there's been a huge upsurge in building of apartments. You see it around Sydney. There are forests now of high-rise apartments where they used to be just single-story houses on 1,200 square meter blocks. That's all gone. There's just these forests of fucking apartments everywhere. In spite of the huge upsurge in building, the price of property has increased at a much faster rate than the new property building. So the idea that if we just build a few more properties, prices will come down, that's bullshit, and it's just not happening. And the statistics quite clearly prove and illustrate that. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.